Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we develop our conversation that we've had from the very beginning of Humanity Rising, from the very first day on May 22nd, 2020, of the challenges of climate change. And today, we're going to talk with Osprey Orielle Lake, who was on that original programming, about women who are on the front lines of climate justice. Before we dive in, I almost feel that I should offer everyone an apology for the fact that rather than dealing with the most critical issue confronting the human family at this time on planet Earth, we've been covering war. Most recently in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians, in Ukraine between the Americans and the Russians, and a variety of other conflicts in our planetary relationships that are inhibiting and in fact precluding us as a human community from dealing with the real issues that are about ready to destroy civilization as we know it. And I'd like to reflect on that for just a minute as we begin this extraordinary contradiction and paradox in the human psyche. Just 3 weeks ago, as the General Assembly convened in New York, in the third week of September, Secretary General Gutierrez said unequivocally that, 3 years ago, I stood before this body and said that we had now entered code red when it comes to climate change, that the climate is now completely out of control. And what he said to the General Assembly just 3 weeks ago, we're now beyond a code red. Humanity, he says, has now opened the gates of hell. And everywhere around the world, extreme weather events are ripping apart not only the ecology, but civilizational infrastructure. And unless we urgently deal with it, we are going to descend into the abyss. And the point he made, which I think is the seminal event, is he said it's no longer that we've got till 2030. We don't even have till 2025. We are now in the moment where no more delay is possible and only a descent into Hades is before us unless we have radical transformations in how humanity views its relationship with the larger ecosystem. But what are we doing? President Biden got up shortly after Gutierrez, and he talked about nothing but war in the Ukraine. And other leaders talked about everything but the climate issue. And so here on Humanity Rising, as we track world events and all the multifariousness of this world, we've been dealing with other events, other issues, more and more, as the global agenda gets more and more crowded with urgent issues like artificial intelligence, which is now another code red issue that humanity has to deal with. And what it is in the human psyche that in the face of cataclysm, and not only the disruption of human civilization, but the possible termination of civilization as we know it, we would do literally nothing and instead spend our time and treasure killing each other and destroying the environment at ever accelerating paces is a challenge, I believe, that all of us would usefully take the time to contemplate, because there's something definitely wrong with this picture. It's within this spirit of some soberness, therefore, that I want to welcome a very good friend and colleague who I've respected for many, many years, Osprey Orielle Lake, who, as I mentioned, was there at the beginning of Humanity Rising, speaking passionately about voices of women on the front lines of climate justice, and in fact convened our first multi-day program on the Indigenous women that she's been working with. She's an artist of some note, dealing with monumental architecture. For those of you who know her work, she's a best-selling author. In fact, has a new book coming out about this whole issue. The story is in our bones, and is preparing for the COP28 in Dubai at the end of November, early December. She's a tireless activist literally on the front lines of climate justice, working with some of the most extraordinarily courageous women anywhere in the world. So Osprey, I want to thank you for all that you're doing and welcome you to Humanity Rising.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for that very generous introduction, and good to be with you today. Yeah.
Osprey has a short video that she's going to play for us that illuminates some of the things that Women's Earth Climate Action Network is doing around the world. And we're going to show that, and then Osprey and I will dialogue for the balance of the hour. So Georg, you want to show the video, or Osprey, why don't you tee it up and then we'll show the video.
Sure. And I'd really love to reflect upon the really powerful opening you gave as well, because I think it's a good place to start. But this video, it's a short video that just shows some of the women that we work with in our network, and it's very specific to some of the advocacy that we've done at the climate negotiations and some of the issues that we're dealing with. And I wanted to start with the video so people can sort of get a flavor of what are some of the key points that Women for Climate Justice are bringing up in these negotiation spaces. And people often ask me, what is it like at the COP? So we put this video together just to give people a sense of that, and to hear, like I said, some of the frontline women that we're working with and some of the issues that are so key to us. So then let's go ahead and show the video. Thank you.
These are the future great-grandmas of a way of being that is balanced, that remembers our relationship to our Mother Earth, our Father Sky, and to all that is.
Frontline women and global advocates are building critical strategies for national and international divestment from harmful extractive industries, while also calling for justice and accountability from financial institutions and governments. 60 of the largest banks in the world have put $4.6 trillion into fossil fuel financing since the adoption of the Paris Climate Agreement. And a report by the UN Environment Program found that governments still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than what would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. We're asking, where is the government regulation? Where are the political leaders standing up to the fossil fuel industry? And where are the real commitments from governments and financial institutions to phase out fossil fuels and instead invest in a just transition?
Colonization divided us, create borders, and violate our lands and bodies. Indigenous women fell and suffered the most because we are in the front lines of the protection of our lands and the protection of our people. Stop dividing us in regions, stop dividing us in borders. If we really want to save the planet, we need all the women from all the regions to discuss and create plans for a better future.
We're talking about giving consent to our own bodies as women, but also when it comes to our land, we need to give our consent if someone is going to enter our territory. And that has not been given in so many cases across the Amazon. And this is why these violations are happening to women and to indigenous people in the Amazon.
They are taking our rights. They are taking women rights. We are taking people rights, community rights, Mother Earth rights. Let's build it together. Let's help women, community on the ground, local community, indigenous community.
In our territory, they are killing the air, they're killing the water, they're killing the earth, they're killing the forelegs, they're killing the fins, and they're doing it with their poisons that they amplify, because those are natural things, part of natural law that belong inside our Mother the Earth. The oil and the gas and those emissions that they put out there are not part of the natural laws, ways of being. They're not part of Mother Earth's plans. We have within our understanding the natural laws, the natural ways.
É preciso garantir a participação das mulheres e da juventude nos espaços de decisão. Aqui no âmbito da COP, a presença e a participação das mulheres ainda é muito invisibilizada. E se nós indígenas, povos indígenas, comunidades tradicionais, estamos apresentando a maior parte da proteção da biodiversidade, nós precisamos estar também como parte da solução.
As women, our roles are to take care of our communities. We are not trying to have power over. When we talk about matriarchs, we are talking about those that care for all of us, that bring forward our children, raise our future generations, care for the land.
It's time to build a new economy that is within the carrying capacity of nature and respects human indigenous rights. And this is what we're really calling for, is that we need a systemic analysis and a systemic change.
No climate justice without human rights. 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 No climate justice without human rights.
Very powerful, Osprey. It's so inspiring to see the women out there in their regalia and just protesting their hearts out for what they so passionately believe in. But why don't we begin with whatever comments that you want to make about the video in my opening, and then I know you're actively preparing for the COP, having just finished Climate Week. So just launch in and cover whatever subjects you would like, and then we'll dialogue from there.
Sounds good, Jim. Thank you. So yeah, just I think where I really want to begin is contextualizing the moment as well, which is that I think all of these different atrocities that we're experiencing in the world right now, as well as the climate crisis, did not suddenly happen. We are in a historical syndrome, a historical phenomena, a historical trauma, a historical oppression that is impacting everyone. And it is presenting itself in a variety of manners. And at the root cause are the systems of patriarchy, of colonization, of capitalism and racism, and I would add imperialism to this as well, which also presents itself as, this militarism that we're experiencing now. And they are all connected. And in the time that we have on a program like this, we can't get into the kind of depth that it actually requires to unpack these things in a good way. And I it's actually one of the reasons that I wrote the book, to take the time to get out of the soundbite conversations that, sort of our world is designed around. Not that this program is that, I'm not suggesting that, but it really takes time to contextualize how did we get here at the precipice of all the things that you discussed, where we're killing each other, where people are being oppressed, where colonization is still the mode of operation, where we have these economic frameworks that are based on extractivism by many names, capitalism being one of them. And at the root cause of these things is really, how are we treating the earth and each other? And, sort of moving out of the intellectual description of this, I also find it enormously heartbreaking. It's just so devastating to be in this condition. And, certainly I feel it on a very personal basis, because we are working with women on the front lines of the climate crisis every day. And, we've just had, between floods and fires and drought, it's just nonstop. We're in it. As you said earlier, and the UN Secretary General pointed out so well, I mean, the hell we imagined has begun. And the question is, what are we going to do now? What can we do? And how do we continue to understand that not all is lost? I'm hesitant to use the hope word right at the moment, but I do have hope. But I think it's built upon understanding the science and understanding that we need to be extraordinarily strategic and bold in this moment. Their incremental change is over. It's not even in the playing field anymore. So just to make a few comments, and I'd love to hand the floor back to you. We have just come from, as you mentioned, the Climate Week that happens every year in New York. And for people who don't know, it's timed with the UN General Assembly. So all world leaders, not all of them, but many world leaders are in New York to discuss matters of the United Nations. And this year was different in that the Secretary General called for a climate ambition summit for one of the days. And I was honored to be selected as one of the civil society participants to participate in that ambition summit. I think actually quite randomly. I'm not sure why I was invited, but anyways, I was there. And, true to a lot of these UN meetings, the Ambition Summit, I'm really glad the Secretary General called for it. I support him. I think he's been a terrific Secretary General. He's been calling things out as they should be. But the summit left many, many questions to be had and didn't exactly move us as we needed to forward on the ambition of climate. The one thing I think that was also really powerful was that the UN did not allow the United States or Australia or China or some of the biggest polluting countries to have the microphone. And that really was powerful because they did not meet the criteria of decreasing fossil fuel expansion and extraction to meet the requirement to be a speaker at the event. So I think these are really good steps forward that are demonstrating a strength of the climate justice movement, the strength of those opposing the fossil fuel industry and governments who refuse to get on with the program that we must phase out fossil fuels. And so I think this is very important. I'll point out a few things that came out of Climate Week and then pause, and then we can talk about the COP coming up. But I think that, of course, what was on the main agenda at Climate Week is everyone angling from every position to demand this fossil fuel phase out. There's nowhere else to go. If we're really going to try to achieve 1.5 degrees, then we absolutely must phase out fossil fuels. And it's amazing to see how much the fossil fuel industry, financial institutions, other industries are doing everything to avoid doing that one thing, coming up with so many false solutions around carbon capture, which has not been proven, trying to do a lot of work around having carbon offsets, which have been proven by one of the leading companies that has been tracking if offsets are actually working. It's been proven that 90% of them are fake earlier this year. So all these other mechanisms to avoid doing the thing that needs to happen, which is moving off of a fossil fuel economy into renewable regenerative energy economy, which we can get into in a little bit. I was really excited that along with many others, we helped organize a march in New York. There was expected to be between 10 and 20,000 people. There were 75,000 people on the streets. It's the biggest climate march since the pandemic. It was huge. So that was really a powerful message to governments that people want this fossil fuel phase out. And it was the central message of the march. Everyone saying, no more fossil fuels, the march to end fossil fuels. There were 700 demonstrations around the world in sister organizations, sister marches. So this is all to say that Climate Week is a buildup to COP28, which the main demand is going to be phase out fossil fuels. No more beating around the bush here. No more kicking the can down the road. And of course, we're in a big challenge because COP28 presidency is Al Jaber, who's the chief executive of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So, we've continued to see this incredible takeover of the COP by industry, and particularly the fossil fuel industry. There's two things I want to point out that I think are really powerful that happened at Climate Week leading into the COP that I wanted to mention that don't get, one of them gets some media attention and the other not so much. One is that WECAN sits on the steering committee of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been really started and chaired by a really powerful woman named Zipporah Berman, and led by many other steering committee members and organizers, and they have their own executive director. But I just really wanted to highlight her work. And it's based upon the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And it's a really innovative idea that's actually gaining a lot of momentum, especially from Pacific Island nations, and Vanuatu and Tuvalu have been two nations that have really put forward and picked up this treaty idea. And what's really powerful about it is that it's a companion piece to the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement has been very valuable to us, but it's not sufficient. And it does call for a 1.5 degree guardrail. And that's been very important to us in our advocacy work with governments and financial institutions to hold them to that. However, it doesn't deal with the supply end. And that's always been the problem with the Paris Agreement. It's about carbon emission reduction, and that has been put into our market system. So what the treaty does is it's talking directly about ending fossil fuels. And it's really been picking up a lot of momentum. It's been endorsed by many different organizations, the World Health Organization. And so we're focusing on this parallel treaty that's absolutely necessary. And it had a lot of momentum in the COP in Egypt last year. It had a lot of momentum this week at Climate Week, and it will also in Dubai. The one other thing I wanted to mention, and the Secretary General mentioned this, not during Climate Week, but earlier, that one of the fastest growing movements in the world right now is towards Earth jurisprudence, meaning laws that affect how we look at nature herself and getting the Earth into the center of the equation. And I'm really honored to be on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature. And at WECAN, we have a very strong Rights of Nature program. And so there was a lot of advocacy during Climate Week around rights of nature, which in essence is a way of having an understanding that in the same way we have the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Humans, that we also need a Universal Declaration on the Rights of Nature. That nature has got to get into, as I say, the center of the equation. And also what's powerful about rights of nature is that it really demands from governments legally that we have thriving and healthy ecosystems that have rights, meaning that right now in our normal courts of law, if you try to stand up for a river or if the ocean or any component of the natural system, it has no rights because nature is considered property under the dominion of humans. So only human stories around nature are being presented in courts of law. And we need to completely rechange that. We need to change our DNA where a river has voice, the ocean has voice, where nature herself has an opportunity to thrive and grow and be understood as a rights-bearing entity. And so this whole momentum around rights of nature has really exploded in the last few years. 30 countries are now looking at, either have passed or are looking at rights of nature in their constitutions or at the national level in different specific cases in their countries at the local level and subnational level. And so I think that was very exciting that there is some real momentum on rights of nature. And of course, I understand that this is outside the norm, but when we see our systems cracking at this level at a terrifying pace, we also know historically that when systems falter, that is actually the opportunity for new ideas to take hold. And that's what we're looking for with this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, with rights of nature, new economy, feminist economies, regenerative economies, moving off of GDP, all these things that we know we need to do. This is our moment to push our agenda, even though it's terrifying. We're up against great odds. We actually have to be really courageous and bold to push forward because we have this new agenda and this is the time for it.
Thank you so much. It's very heartening what you're saying, actually. And I think my first question, Osprey, has to do with how are you understanding the broader feeling or strategic thinking of the sort of the major organizations that have been in the climate justice movement, for many, many decades. One thinks of everything that Bill McKibben has been doing. One thinks of, the major organizations like Friends of the Earth or Sierra Club and Greenpeace and so forth and so on. Here we have Gutierrez saying we're basically out of time. Would it be fair to say that the climate movement is coalescing together for the first time around ending fossil fuels? Was that just an impulse that came together sort of in New York? But everybody's now sort of working in their own way on their own agendas, as it were, because that's been one of the challenges of the climate movement historically, is the lack of unity and lack of collective focus on one goal. And yet we're now out of time. So as you're saying, we need to really do something that is immediate transformational. But how is this, your view, being received sort of out there among climate activists and sort of major climate organizations that are working on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always hesitant to speak for other organizations or try to sort of coalesce what everyone's doing, but I'll do my best because there's so, I think that every major organization in this space, does have their own agenda, as you rightly pointed out. But I do think, having said that, what I did see in New York, and I do think we will head into the COP with this collective demand around fossil fuel phase out. I do think that is happening. And I do think that that's very powerful that all of the different movements have coalesced around that point. No more fossil fuels. Now,
well, that would be extraordinary if that is actually the case.
Yeah, I think everyone's going into the COP with that. And I will say that last year, there was a collective push. I mean, I would say there's like maybe a collective demand, and then it starts dispersing from there about what does that mean, which I'll get into in a second. But just to point out that it's not the only time. When we went to COP27 in Egypt last year, there was a collective demand around loss and damage. And we won on that. The movements won on that. Governments were not going into COP27, even the United States making some comments that it was not the issue that was going to be addressed. But the pressure from governments that were pushing for loss and demand, primarily global South countries who are hurting the most, and then the collective movements together of all the different climate groups pushed on loss and damage, and we won. And just in short, because I don't want to get too far down that road, it's a very important issue because loss and damage is really accounting for the fact of the communities and countries being hurt first and worst by climate change. And how are they going to care for the people with the damage already being done to their communities? And the reason it is such a key win is it provides a climate justice framework. So there's working on climate issues. And when we say climate justice, the justice component is really a big word here because it centers not only nature, which is most important as well, but also, how do we have a fair, just transition? How do we have fairness to between the global South and the global North, those who've polluted the most, the wealthy countries, and those that have not, and Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities? How do we center those that are already experiencing the worst impacts? So that loss and damage victory was huge. So it has happened before, and I think we will go into COP28 with that same focus on that singular demand. Whether or not we get it is a whole nother thing. It's the biggest thing on the table right now, and the thing that everybody at the industry and government levels doesn't want to do. So, but it's very important that that's the demand.
Yeah, well, it's an extraordinary thing, just to take a moment to tease out the contradiction. So here you have, on the one hand, the situation is so bad, we've got to get rid of fossil fuels immediately. And on the other hand, the oil industry is basically taken over the COP because the president of the COP is the oil minister. And as you pointed out in your remarks in the video, I think it's 4.3 trillion has been spent on fossil fuels, and the national governments are doubling their output and consumption of oil. So you have this antinomy of the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. And Dubai, one of the oil capitals of the world, is where you're going to fight that battle. I mean, from a poetic point of view, it's a perfect storm, if you think about it. You're a courageous woman, Osprey Orielle Lake.
And many others who've been leading in this movement. I tell you, it's and that's exactly the point. I mean, this is why we go. People often say, well, why are you going to the COP? Nothing ever happens there. Nothing ever good comes out of there. So just to be clear, we do not go to the COP thinking we're going to go win climate change or something. That's not the point. The point is that, I go to the COP because I personally refuse to have all the governments meet with the fossil fuel industry and financial institutions and decide our future without us saying something, having interventions, and pointing out other ways that we could be moving forward. So I find it extremely valuable to go because then they're going to be left alone behind closed doors, making deals that would even be far worse.
Exactly.
If civil society has not been on the ground all these years, we wouldn't have 1.5 degrees as a guardrail. We would not have loss and damage. We would not have a demand for wealthy countries to be responsible. Now, could it be much better? Of course. But without that push, we would be far worse and far worse conditions than we are now. And there is still the 11th hour save that we can't give up on in terms of what we can accomplish rapidly. And I think that's also important to say. I think also, as we talk about, which is really interesting and tragic at the same time, is that the largest delegations going to these COPs for some years now has been the fossil fuel industry.
Exactly.
But what surprises most people is that the second largest group of delegates that go when you combine together are Indigenous peoples, which I find very interesting. Yeah. And that's because Indigenous peoples have been leading movements to stop the destruction of Mother Earth and their communities for the longest. And they're very well aware that they are going to be in those spaces where their futures and their lands are being decided. So that's why, we can, year after year, over a decade now, easily over a decade, we've gone to every COP with an Indigenous women's delegation to ensure that their voices are heard and they can directly have access to governments and to these meetings. Now, the access to some of the most important meetings is still not given, and it's a huge demand that we have. And this year we've actually been meeting, WECAN has been meeting, and others as well, with the high-level champions. Every year there's high-level champions appointed who can champion causes at the COP. And this year, the champion is very interested in Indigenous and gender issues. So we're hoping that there's going to be a way to have a dialogue to make sure that women and Indigenous leaders have a lot more opportunity to be in some of the negotiating rooms where sometimes they are barred from entering and having intervention. And think about the insanity of that. 80% of the biodiversity left on Earth, meaning our forests, our water, the land, life, is in the hands and lands of Indigenous peoples. And that means the way that they are living in their worldview and their steward and protection of those lands is incredibly valuable and something that we all need to learn from. And yet those very people are not allowed into the spaces where the future of the planet and what's going to happen with, these ecosystems are being discussed. It makes zero sense. We are not going to the experts.
Yeah. Well, I just want to bring in what just happened in Australia. Here they had a plebiscite, a national plebiscite, to do the most commonsensical thing in the world, and that is allow the Aboriginal people who've been there for 100,000 years a seat at the table, a seat in the legislature. And the Australians, the Aboriginals couldn't vote, but the Australians voted and said no. And now we're in the middle of, an Aboriginal week of silence, as they're calling it. And it made me deeply sad that a country sort of as so-called civilized and aware as Australia would not even allow its own Indigenous people into the halls of Parliament. And by the majority will of the Australians, almost all of which are white, of course. It's really quite amazing.
It is. I think it is tragic. And, I have colleagues in Australia, and they're devastated. Indigenous people, Aboriginal people in Australia are devastated. This is terrifying, really. And it is, to me, an extension of what we were talking about just a few minutes ago about we need to look at a systemic change. We have to realize, as these wars are going on, this vote in Australia, the COP coming up in 2028 being led by the fossil fuel industry, that one of the positions we take at WECAN is that we need to deal with the immediate crises in front of us, the floods, the drought, the fire, the immediate needs of forest protection. I'll talk a little bit about our programs as well, about what we're actually doing on the ground. And so we have this very real work that must go on, and that is on crisis mode.
Yeah.
At the same time, it is equally important, if we're really going to look for long-term solutions and healing and restoration and reciprocity with the earth and each other, then we have to have a look also at systemic change and do both at the same time. It's not enough to just do one or the other. So as an example, core to the pillars at WECAN are Indigenous rights, women's rights, rights of nature, and rights of future generations. And so we infuse those pillars into all the work that we do, so that while we're reforesting in the DR Congo or fighting to protect the Amazon rainforest, that we are also looking for how do we bring into our programs a deep analysis of new economy. How do we address patriarchy? How do we unpack some of these systems that have gotten us into the crisis? And I think that's really important, that we are able to look at things in a way that we are dismantling dangerous systems while we're building new systems, and it really goes hand in hand.
Well, let's pause there for a moment on WECAN, because I consider what you're doing with the Earth and Women's Earth and Climate Action Network to be one of the premier frontline organizations, I think, in the world. I think you're taking on more critical issues. And I think you're also, and I think this is you, Osprey, more than anything, you have such a deeply analytical mind that you're really bringing not only the courage of direct encounter, stop oil, which can be reduced to a slogan, but also an analysis, a deep analysis that enables people to understand the etiology, the origins of the issues that are really challenging the world. And I think that's one of the distinguishing characteristics of WECAN is that frontline work with the deep analysis. So, I mean, as you look at the work of WECAN, why don't you just pick one or two projects that are particularly seminal at the moment, and just share with our audience what you and the other Indigenous women are up to.
Sure. Be glad to. I think I'll start with talking a little bit about our forest program. And also, if people go to our WECAN YouTube page on website, a lot of the programs we're doing have like short videos so people can see a little bit deeper into it. But I'm thinking, since I mentioned it earlier, of a program that we have in the DR Congo, which we've been working on for about 8 years now, which is one of the most violent places in the world for women to live, also because of war and conflicts there. So we have been planting and reforesting trees in an area that was just completely deforested through slash and burn techniques and other extraction. And so these trees we've been planting have all been planted by women. There's like 500 women involved in this program. And, this many years later, we have done a huge amount of reforestation to the point where 1.8 million acres of old growth forest, which is key to carbon sequestration and biodiversity. We have pulled all those communities out from basically continuing to use the forest for their daily needs. Because of displacement and colonization, a lot of the Indigenous people in the area were now needing to use the old growth forest. And now all of them, communities like 50,000 people are all moved off the old growth into the trees that we've planted. So 25% of the trees that we've planted are for human use, for medicines, for food, for housing, and 75% of the trees that we planted are to rewild the forest. And so it's rewilding, but also dealing with community needs. And I think what's interesting about the project is that it's really brought a lot of power to the women in a very patriarchal society, because they're the ones who now have these forests. And there happens to be a unique law in the DR Congo where if you utilize land that is considered like throwaway land in this case, and you start utilizing it, you're an owner of that land. So now women are land owning to these forested areas. And they've shared with me so many amazing stories and some very funny stories about how, their whole culture is changing because of the dynamic of them having power in their communities. and how it's changing their social structure. The last thing I'll say about that program is that, which I didn't expect, and this is what I mean about these things we don't know in the 11th hour save, is that, of course, scientists can tell you, but I didn't know it would happen so quickly, is because of all the trees that we've planted, the rains are coming back. The trees are calling the rain back. And so now in this very drought-stricken area, the rains are coming and Mother Earth is reseeding herself. And so there's all these wild nurseries that have come up along with the nurseries that we've built.
Beautiful.
Also give people hope, like there's other factors at play here. And then we do work in the Amazon to protect the Ecuadorian and Brazilian Amazon, working with Mujeres Amazónicas, a really powerful, fierce group of Indigenous women leaders in the area. And in Brazil, I would really like to note Sonia Guajajara, who we've worked with for years, and in the new Bolsonaro government was appointed as the first Minister of Indigenous Peoples. And she's been doing an incredible amount of work to, again, give demarcation and sovereignty to Indigenous people in Brazil to protect their territories, which is very important to their rights and sovereignty and way of life, but also important to all of us to protect the Amazon. And then I'll just point out one other piece of work that I think is really valuable in addition to our advocacy with governments is we've been for years building this relationship with financial institutions. And right now we're in dialogue with the Equator Principles Association, which is an association of over 130 of the world's largest banks, all of them. And we've been building a relationship to have workshops with them on an annual basis. As well, I will say we have an inside and outside strategy. We work to bring forward information to them around like why carbon offsets don't work, why we need real zero versus net zero in our work to reduce the use of fossil fuels. What are their fossil fuel phase out programs, and bring really would be considered radical climate justice ideas to their bank representatives. At the same time, we still protest and get arrested outside of the banks when we don't like what they're doing. So we have this really interesting relationship, both with governments and financial institutions, where we need to be in dialogue. We must be in dialogue with people in power. There's just, we're done with the phase where we can just say, we don't like what you're doing. We've got to roll up our sleeves and get in a dialogue with these folks.
Exactly.
So we're in dialogue.
I'm in Washington.
Yeah, we got to be in dialogue with the government leaders.
Totally.
We've got to be in dialogue with business leaders. We've got to be in dialogue with financial institutions, but we reserve our right to protest as well. So it's kind of an inside and outside strategy. And I think we need to do both.
Yeah, gotcha. By the way, when you spoke about the Amazon, you mentioned the indigenous woman being pointed by Bolsonaro. You meant Lula, right?
Oh, excuse me. Oh my God. Oh.
Yeah, you meant Lula.
Thank you for correcting me. That's a horrible error on my part. The thing is, we were fighting Bolsonaro for so long that
Yeah.
His name is on my tongue. Lula. Sorry. Lula. Blah. I won't be. Thank you for correcting me.
Not to worry.
But
now,
yeah,
let me
it's really exciting to have her in.
Let me probe a little deeper on this what you're doing with the banks, because if you can crack the banks, they're bigger than governments, and in some ways they're bigger than corporations, because they're the money, that's treasure. And so I would just love to get a deeper feel. Do you feel like you're making any headway? Are the lights going on in the boardrooms of the banks? Because surely somebody at that level can see what's happening to the world and knows that they're resourcing the very momentum that's destroying it. So talk a little bit more about sort of the psychodynamics of what you're doing with the banks and whether you're making any headway. I mean, in terms of the hearts and minds level of engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I can say some, and I will say that one of the reasons we're in the relationship we are is that a lot of it is closed doors. So I can say a little bit because it's a delicate situation. It's a very delicate situation. precisely because of what you point out. I mean, I would say there's a whole sector of, the banks and the asset management firms and their leadership that go hand in hand with the fossil fuel industry, and that go hand in hand with government officials who want business as usual, who are not budging one iota, not at all. It's just a wall of, this is how we do business. We're in the extractive business, and we're going to meet our quarterly returns, and we're going to make money, and there's no discussion. Now, I don't know them personally, and what they're talking about at home and to their children, but in our conversations with them, there is a stiff wall. That is not true of everybody in the financial sector that we talk to at all. And I would go so far as to say is there are some banks and some asset management firm representatives I've talked to where, and I don't think it's crossing a line to say, when we have brought as an example, Indigenous or Black community leaders who have, because I think it's also important to talk about Black and Brown communities who have also been experiencing horrific harm in their communities for decades because of the fossil fuel industry or through, other extractive industries like mining. And we will not, it's not the only thing we do, but we will bring frontline delegations to speak to the banks and speak to the asset management firms and speak to them specifically about a project we want them to stop, and have people from the community talk to them. And yeah, it definitely moves hearts and minds. I have definitely been in meetings and seen bank representatives cry. So like that is, not nothing. And so there's that component of, the reality of sitting across the table from someone who's saying, what you're doing is killing my community, or this is, even not looking to the future of the climate crisis, but right now, this is how fossil fuel extraction and infrastructure is impacting me. This is how many people in my family have cancer and have died. This is what is happening to my children.
Yeah.
That is human to human contact. And that's what I mean. We need to be in dialogue. And, I want to share one more story, but just to note that if you go to our website at wecaninternational.org, every year for the last 3 years, we've put out a report called The Gendered and Racial Impacts of the Fossil Fuel Industry and Complicit Financial Institutions. I know that's a really big mouthful, but it's basically how right now, currently, the fossil fuel industry is impacting the health and safety of women, and particularly communities of color and Indigenous peoples, already from missing and murdered Indigenous women that are happening because of man camps when these men come into communities to build pipelines or do fossil fuel extraction, and what they do to the women, Indigenous women particularly, Black women, and how their mental health, their physical health, their maternal health is completely destroyed by the pollution from these industries. This has been going on for decades. And this is why we need to bring in the lens, which we call an intersectional lens, of what is going on. And that's what I mean by systemic analysis, because this is where we must talk about white supremacy and the role of racism and colonization in the situation we're in. Because if the fossil fuel industry and these financial institutions did not have a place to do this dirty work of pulling out dirty energy that's polluting communities, if there was nowhere to do that because we lived in equity, they would be shut down. And this is why it's so key to understand the connection between colonization, racism, our economic system, and patriarchy, because if we address those root causes, we begin to unpack and lead ourselves to healthy communities, because there should be no one harmed. There should not be sacrificed people, sacrificed zones. The only way these industries can continue is because we give them license under white supremacy to harm communities that don't look like us. And that's not right. That's not okay. And that's why we need climate justice. Going back to the conversation around what you brought up, around, are we having any impact? I will say, we're working on a few cases now that I cannot talk about, but I will talk about the Dakota Access Pipeline, which, by the way, is up right now for a comment period. I encourage people to go make comment. That fight for Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock is not over. And they're still operating on an illegal environmental impact statement. And right now, there's a time to comment on it publicly for us to say this isn't right. But during, the Dakota Access Pipeline fight at Standing Rock, I was asked by Indigenous women leaders to create a delegation that was co-led with a very powerful Indigenous Dene woman, Michelle Cook, an attorney. Tarhauska was a part of it, many other powerful women leaders. And we went to major banks in Europe, and we got hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars divested out of the Dakota Access Pipeline. When they heard the stories, when we showed them the human rights violation,
Fantastic.
the Indigenous rights violation, the harms that occurred there, they pulled their money out. And so this is a strategy. The thing I will close on that is that unfortunately requires there to be bodily harm. The Dakota Access Pipeline was successful for us in our divestment work because so many people have been hurt and it was so huge. So I will say that it is a David and Goliath situation where we need so much power and civil society movement and people willing to risk arrest and put their bodies on the line to get a response. It's not fair, but that is the state of affairs.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Let's turn to your book, because your last book, I think, won a Nautilus Award, didn't it? It did very well, and you're really a true intellectual about these matters, as I've noted. So tell us about what led to you writing the book that is now coming out, that everybody, you can pre-order it. The Story in Our Bones. This is a great title. But Osprey, tell us about your new book.
Thank you for bringing that up, Jim. The Story is in Our Bones: How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis. So that is the title of the book. And I wrote the book during the sort of lockdown phase, if you will, of the pandemic, over the weekends. That's what I did. And I wanted to bring together a book that wove together an intersectional analysis of this moment, but also offer pathways forward. And what I would say, sort of in a nutshell, is that, as you can hear, we're working on a daily basis on putting out a lot of fires, but we need to move also upstream. Like, where is this coming from? How do we deal with our collective trauma as society? Where is it coming from? And so the book moves through different historical contexts so that we can understand, how did we get here? And you start the book sort of with a big overview of how do we understand time? How do we understand our relationship to change? And this is why I got into the topic of worldview, because no matter how many times I stand to stop a pipeline or talk to this or that bank or go to the COP, I know that behind that, we're not going to get the systemic change we want without looking at our worldviews and addressing where did they come from and how do we dismantle some worldviews, but actually also recover and reclaim our own ancestries and our own knowledge of how we live in harmony with the land and the earth. Because if we keep going back to our recent historical past, we just will continue to perpetuate these conundrums that we're in that are violent and devastating, including the violence against the earth and how it connects to violence against women, as we have lost our goddess traditions, as we have lost our understanding of the balance between the female and male sacred principle. We need to actually go back and reclaim what our culture is, to regenerate and sort of rewild and regenerate who we are. And that means not only sort of reclaiming the sacred feminine, but the sacred masculine as well. We have destroyed our goddesses and gods, to put it really quite simply. But it's more than that. It's also about looking at pre-colonial and pre-patriarchal contexts. And what do I mean by that? Because these are all just these words we can throw around. But for me, it's going back in my own journey to when my own ancestors were, before they were colonized, to go back and see before patriarchal institutions impacted my own ancestry. Because if we cannot understand where we've come from in a balanced context, it's very difficult to build going forward. Because what do we base it upon? If we don't have a worldview that, as an example, sees an animate nature, if we can't see that the birds outside our home or the trees or the whole of Gaia is alive, it's super difficult to create governance structures, economic structures, social structures that are not only just, but also living within the boundaries, the planetary boundaries. And so our whole foundation is so corrupt and misinformed that it's really difficult to bring everything into alignment. And so while I go into a lot of practical examples of how to implement climate justice and implement Indigenous rights, rights of nature, and offer a lot of solutions, I'm also asking the reader to go on a journey with me about root causes, because we also have to change ourselves. It's an internal and external journey going on at the same time. And then lastly, I would say it's also looking at systems around worldview, offering a lot of traditional ecological knowledge, but also one of my favorite parts, even though there's some, we go into the depths of things, people will get a little uncomfortable. We need to get a little uncomfortable to grow. But I also really had a lot of fun towards the end of the book, getting into also language and words and maps and how all of these things impact our relationship with the natural world and our worldviews, how in fact words are another way that impact our mind, and what the role of language even is in this transformation we're in. So I'll just leave it at that. That was a lot.
No, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I mean, there's no doubt that we're at one of those moments in history where everything, literally everything, has to be rethought and reframed. And that's one of the things that excites me about being here in Washington, working on the extraterrestrial issue. It's a meme that when it comes out, that there's incontrovertible evidence that extraterrestrial civilizations exist. They've been on planet Earth for some time. There's evidence of contact that the U.S. government is now in the process of divulging into the public domain. It stimulates a complete rethinking of everything that you thought you knew in a world in which the planet and humanity was alone in a vast, empty universe. And now we discover it's not only full of life, but that life and those civilizations have been in contact with us for some time. And so your book is getting at the same thing. How do we use this crisis as an unprecedented opportunity to rethink, both from the outside and the inside, the kind of transformational identity that enables us to create a new world?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that, and I think this is the one thing I think that's really interesting about this conversation that I'm also exploring and curious too with your thoughts, Jim, is that there's the immediate crisis we're facing, and for me, a real need to have that climate justice lens so that we ensure that we don't duplicate white supremacy. In other words, for me, it's also about having Indigenous and Black and Brown communities leading a way, both in terms of social, economic, and cultural justice, but also with their cultural knowledge that is more intact than sort of the myth of whiteness and what whiteness even is. I mention that because I think we need to stay very grounded in the fact that people are fighting for their lives and experiencing, tremendous trauma and pain and being killed and oppressed. And these colonial imperialistic structures are barreling down on people right now as we speak. And we're wanting to create space for this creative, regenerative, reciprocity, understanding of worldview, time and space in different ways, the extraordinary capacity we have to communicate with plants and animals that we need to reclaim and rejuvenate once again, the beauty of our ancestral histories. Even in the dominant culture, when we go back, we have ancestors who built sacred stone wheels all over Europe, practiced well dressings, had amazing ceremonies with the land, and all of this needs to be brought forward and healed. And the space I'm interested in is actually in between here, because this in between space, we can't sort of have this spiritual or political bypassing over here and not marry that with real-time disasters. And so this space in between is often avoided. And so for me, we need to start with on the ground and build our way and bridge cohesively these different worlds together. Because all too often, no judgment, because people don't know what to do. We're all exploring what to do. We can get into these very high level spiritual conversations, which I believe in. I need spiritual healing. I want to have my ceremonies on the land. But I also think that it needs to be intersectional, intermarried with actual on the ground urgent experiences that do not recreate white supremacy in a world in which we do not listen to those who are being impacted first and worst by so many harms, but also who have knowledge that is essential to everyone. So for me, it is sitting at the feet of Indigenous and Black and Brown communities right now as part of my spiritual practice, as much as sitting at the feet of the ancient redwood trees and the ocean. It has to be together.
Beautiful. Beautifully put. I think we'll take that as a final note. Sitting at the foot of the redwoods, sitting at the foot of the Indigenous peoples and imbibing their wisdom, because they come from the pristine primordial world, and then applying that to the challenges that we face. And in that process, developing in ourselves a whole new identity of self and community and humanity and planet. So Osprey, it's always such a pleasure talking with you. I so admire both your courage on the front lines, but the brilliance of your mind. It's quite extraordinary, I must say. Quite extraordinary. So thank you so much, and we wish you all the best with the women you'll be taking to the COP. We'll be convening on Humanity Rising some sessions during that week, and maybe at some point during that time you can come in and talk to us about what you're up to in Dubai.
Absolutely. I'd love to. Thank you, Jim, so much, and best wishes with Humanity Rising in your work. And it's always an honor and pleasure to have time with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, it's the story is in our bones, everyone. You can pre-order it on Amazon. You've seen the link in the chat box, but you can just go to Amazon.com and look up the book, or look up Osprey Orielle Lake for, I think, a compelling read for our moment. So that'll bring us to a close for today. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the chat link in the chat box. You also received it in your Zoom invite. And then we'll see you all here again tomorrow for a very interesting discussion on the Urantia book with one of the leading world experts, Byron Belitzos, on the Urantia material, which has one of the most extraordinary descriptions of extraterrestrial civilizations anywhere in the world. So that's tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Osprey. Bye for now.